Hi there and welcome to the channel. Now this video will be rather different to my usual fare. I thought I would follow up on my previous video where I was celebrating being hired as an instructor at National Taiwan University with something vaguely pedagogical, but I'm not going to cast myself in the role of an instructor and you, the viewer, in the role of a student. But I thought I would address this question of how one reads, because I do think people wonder, is there some major difference between how a typical or general reader approaches a text and someone who is a student of literature, or even, dare I say it, a would-be scholar. So with all these books behind me, is it just a case of picking them up and just reading them, or is there a bit more to it than that? Now the simple answer is yes. There is a huge difference between how I read now after many years of reading and how I read at the beginning. But the key point is this: that difference doesn't arise specifically from having pursued formal studies. And actually, nowhere during your time at university are you going to have a professor say, okay class, today we're going to learn how to read. Or even, today class, we're going to talk about making effective notes. That simply doesn't happen. And what the result of that fact is each student pretty much has to come up with their own approach. And so what I can talk about today is my own reading process. I'm not going to call it a system. It's not a system. It's a process. And that hopefully will give you some insight into what it means to me, the disappointed man, when I read, and it may point you in the direction of what you might want to do differently if, as the title of this video suggests, you're going to be getting more from your reading. So that's the plan. I think there are 5 or so suggestions. Without any further ado, let's get into them. So the biggest difference between how I used to read and how I read now are 2 secret weapons that I employ, and they are a pencil and a ruler. And it's got to the point where I would say that if I don't have access to a pencil, then I won't read, because if I don't have a pencil with which to make notes, then I'm not going to be able to get the full benefit out of what I'm reading. I may as well just wait until I do have my pencil there. The ruler, obviously, for underlining passages that I'm interested in. Now, you may have noticed something's missing: the highlighter. No, never ever use a highlighter. They absolutely destroy the look of your books, and I don't believe highlighting really works if you want to learn. All it does is basically point you to parts of the text that you then have to read again to get the meaning from. So that is not really a benefit. I'll come on to the kind of notes one makes, but first, if you are going to get more from your reading, you must invest in a pencil and a ruler. Okay, next. Now, before I proceed any further, I know there'll be people watching already recoiling in horror at seeing that pencil, because some people just don't want to deface their books. They want to keep them in pristine condition. And it did take me a long time to get over this hurdle. But if you're dealing with mass-produced books, then there's really no reason not to just write in them for your own benefit. That book, that text, is a tool to help you develop yourself. And so for that reason, I've basically overcome my resistance to writing in my books, even if, and we're going to use this as an example in this video, I have a particularly nice hardback edition Library of America of Edith Wharton's short stories, 1891 to 1910. Strongly recommended. Amazing writing. But as you'll see here, there I am, scrawling in pencil all over this beautiful paper without any reservations. So don't be put off writing in your books. However, having said that, 2 qualifications. Firstly, if you have a book like this, it's worth about $600 US. I'm not going to be writing in this one. Okay, so when the books get valuable, now, of course, I'll refrain from writing in them. And another approach sometimes people might use is multiple copies of the same book. One of them you just keep, and the other one you write all your notes in. So I've also seen this approach from time to time. Whatever it is, you've got to find a way to get over that mental hurdle of writing in your books. Why not choose a book that you don't like at the start and read it and write all over it? Okay, just to get yourself into it and assure yourself that you really can benefit from this approach. Then you'll be ready to sort of move forwards. Okay, now let's get on to the kind of notes you should be making. Now, before you begin making notes of your own, many books come with notes already there, prepared for you by scholars. And so that is another consideration. These Penguin Classics editions contain no notes whatsoever. So no professor would ever sign this edition for a class. These are just for general readers. The only reason I pick them up is when I don't have a critical edition yet of a particular text. And when I find one, well, I can just throw these away. Okay, so you want to find books with scholarly notes, and you'll also need to be aware that you get different kinds of apparatus. So this M.R. James collection of ghost stories is my favorite way to have the notes arranged. Well, one of my favorite ways. And that is you get the little number next to a mention in the text, and from that number you can then go to the back and look at that number, and oh yes, there's the note. Okay, so this is quite useful. But then what you'll also notice is this other way of doing it, where the text has no indications of its notes, and then you go to the back, and this is an Oxford World's Classics, and you find page numbers that refer you to the notes. And this is a much more cumbersome way of going about it. So you may wish to shop around in terms of notes. Then you can kind of pursue this note-taking mission to a pitch, and that would be, for example, if you're reading a book like this, Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel. Obviously this was translated from the French, so all the notes in here are in English by English scholars. But if I'm really going to write about it, I'll have an edition in the original language, and I'll read the notes by French scholars. So you see, you go as far as you need to in terms of what your learning goals are. Okay, with that out of the way, now we really can move on to taking notes of your own. Now, in my view, the biggest mistake people make when they take notes is condensing the note too much. That is, they don't write out really what they're thinking, and they just try to put perhaps a single word or a phrase. That is not enough. You have to imagine that you're going to come back to these notes 6 months, a year, 5 years from now, and if that note is to have any lasting value at all, you should be able to read it and think, aha, now I can see what I was thinking at that time. That reminds me. Maybe your thinking's changed in the interim, but the notes are of no use if they're so concentrated in their form that you just can't really work out what you were trying to say. And I have to say as well, keep your handwriting tidy. You may notice that your handwriting is not as easy to read as you might have imagined, and you come back many years later and you're just like, well, what is it? So 2 considerations there. Now, in terms of what you focus the notes on, the principle I wish to introduce is saturation. So when I was learning French, well, I still am learning French, I had this principle of saturation. That is, here's a copy of Stephen Hero by Joyce in French. You want to get to the point where you understand absolutely everything on the page, all of the vocabulary and all of the grammatical constructions. Now that takes an awful lot of reading. We're talking about thousands and thousands of pages, but you have to aim extremely high. And so saturation is the goal. Now for reading texts in your own language, it's going to be different. You're not going to be trying to pick up on grammatical constructions, but vocabulary, lexical choices made by the author, you're still going to find, even at the age of 50-something, like myself, that there are words in a story that you may not be familiar with, particularly if you're reading stories from 100 or more years ago. So, having read this Edith Wharton story, The Angel at the Grave, which was really excellent actually, I found 5 words that I didn't know already. And so I made a note of these, looked up their definitions with my dictionary and wrote them in. So I'll show you the first one, induration. And this is a medical term, and it means a thickening and hardening of soft tissues of the body. And it's being used metaphorically here. And then, let me give you another one. We had, Oh, modus vivendi. So I know this already, but if you're learning and you're not aware of what these tags from Latin or Greek mean, so here you've got modus vivendi, a way of life. And then I had, all right, antiphon. And that was a short sentence sung or recited before or after a psalm or canticle. So it's a very obscure word there. And caloric, and that is relating to heat. And I've made a note here, calor, Spanish, which means heat. And here, amphioxus, a very obscure word in here, and it's a kind of precursor of a fish, I guess. It's a jawless fish, extremely ancient, and associated with this is notachord, which is its spine, like a very simple spine. And finally, lucubrations, and these are writings or studies, and it's also used of learned or pedantic writing. So one part of the note making should be those lexical items you're unfamiliar with. By the end of it, you'll have an enormous vocabulary, and that is part of your goal as a learner. Shall I throw in some words here that you may not be aware of? These are some examples that have come out of my reading lately. Riparian, relating to rivers. Vulnerary, of herbs which can be used to treat wounds. Yet, Y-E-T-T, Scottish term for a gate. And then we have eclept, which means by the name of. Anent, regarding, and on it goes. So, first thing, note-taking, lexical units, new vocabulary. Okay, next. Now you're going to want to make notes on the substance of the story. So how do you go about this? Well, you have to go on a case-by-case basis. So you have to look at what the story is about, and then that can be a focus for your notes. So here the Angel at the Grave presents 60 years in the life of one woman, and it does so in only 16 pages. So how does it manage that? Okay, that is interesting. So reading the text, what I found was that rather than have just sudden jumps, like you'll have in some short stories that deal with a large span of time, a paragraph will end and then it will say something like 10 years later. Okay, that is one way to do it. No, what you find here is the use of iterative time and singulative time. Now, iterative time is very close to description. It's often at the beginning of stories, especially 19th century stories. They'll set up all the background for you, and you might not even meet the central character, the protagonist, until all of this background has been provided for you. So it can feel rather slow moving to the contemporary reader. All right, but it is the way they used to do it. So this story begins in that traditional way. And the kinds of sentence you'll find is, we'd been to the beach many times that summer, or the house had stood for 60 years. Many people had come and gone through its doorway, many births, many marriages. What you're basically doing is having repeated events just narrated a single time. That is iterative. And then you'll have a switch to singulative. And this is a unique event narrated once. And it's typical of events that drive the plot. And they'll usually be presented in considerable detail. And what you find in this story is there are only 4 plot points for 60 years of story time. Quite incredible, actually. What that points to is how little action there's really been in this woman's life, which is true because she's been pretty much solitary for the whole of that period, staying inside her house and just attending to various affairs. So, for example, 10 years was spent writing a book about her dead grandfather, a literary figure, and that is presented in iterative time. And then you switch to the plot again, where she goes to the publisher and he rejects the book. He says, if only you brought this 10 years earlier. And she thinks, oh, why is that? And he says, well, 10 years ago there was a market for this book. Now there's no market, take it away. Okay, and then you go back into an iterative section where she's kind of moping over this reaction for a number of years, and then suddenly you get another plot point. And the final one, she's a very old lady, in her 70s perhaps, and suddenly this final development provides a happy ending of sorts. So because this book deals with quite a span of time, I focused my note-taking on how it accomplished that feat. But there are just general things in stories that you might wish to take notes about or underline beautiful passages, reversals, and one thing I find also particularly interesting are switches of narrator. There are no switches of narrator in The Angel at the Grave, but the preceding story, The Duchess at Prayer, which is even better than The Angel at the Grave, it's rather reminiscent of one of Poe's fictions. The Cask of Amontillado springs to mind. You have a person alive being walled in horrible fashion during this story, but actually the guy who's narrating this event doesn't realize its full import, but the gentleman who's listening, and you the reader, you do, you've managed to make this inference for yourself. But here you have all kinds of different voices supplying their own account of different things that they've seen, and Wharton has pulled them together and provided an overarching narrator that allows you to have this wonderfully complex story assembled in front of your eyes. And yes, that is something that I'll also attend to. How is she doing this? It's very artful in the case of Wharton, not always so skillfully handled. Okay, so that is a kind of note-taking on the substance of the story. There are two more kinds, and these ones require a lot more reading to have gone on. So the first of these requires you to have read everything, ideally, by the author in question, or at least a lot. So the idea here is you've read a lot of Wharton, and then reading through a particular work, a short story or a novel, you find something that links to another work by her. So reading this, I'll give you an example. There was one sentence I underlined. Here it is. But it is the eye which supplies the colouring matter, and Paulina's brimmed with the richest hues. Now, on its own, it doesn't seem to mean very much, but this idea of the way you view things, imbuing them with significance, with meaning, with beauty, connects you to the first story in this collection, Mrs. Manstey's View, which was actually the first short story Wharton had published, which also concerns this idea of reading into your environment and basically generating meaning from what you see. So that is the kind of link I'll be trying to establish. That could be the basis for an article, vision in the short fiction of Edith Wharton, something like that. You'd find all the mentions you could, place them side by side, and then analyze the differences between them. That is scholarly work. That is generating knowledge. But as you can see, it does require a lot of reading. The last one requires even more reading, and that is linking a text with works by other writers. So here you have to have also read a lot. And what I found reading this is there was no single text I could link The Angel at the Grave with. However, I was able to detect two influences at work on Wharton by reading 5 or 6 of these stories. One of them was Flaubert, with her use of this detached, ironic narrator. So I checked and I found indeed Wharton was greatly influenced by Flaubert. She admired him very much. And then the wit that you find in Wharton's stories seemed very reminiscent of Oscar Wilde. And there's even a short story in here, The Twilight of the God. Not a very good short story, but it's presented as a play, and it's very much a sub-Wildian sketch. So influences at work are interesting too. How can that be of use? Well, what you tend to find is at the beginning of a writer's career, their influences are very visible because they may be very much in thrall to particular writers they admire, but over the course of their career, they more and more develop their own unique approach. And so you can kind of watch Flaubert and Wilde receding as you go further through these stories and get into the heart of Wharton herself as a unique artist. And that is all of the note-taking I would do that is centered on the book and the notes and a dictionary and an encyclopedia. But there is one more type of note-taking that you can do, and that is to go off and investigate secondary sources. And I went on JSTOR and found a 4-page article about The Angel at the Grave, and what the writer was doing was arguing that this story is deliberately linked to another work, and that is Hawthorne's The House with the Seven Gables, or The House of the Seven Gables. I haven't read it yet, although I know there is a copy on the shelves behind me hiding somewhere. But what this allows you to do, if you can't make that external link yourself to another artwork, another literary text, you can find scholars that have already done that. And then you consider the merits or not of their argument. I'd have to read Hawthorne's novel and then read this again to decide if I'm convinced or not. But that can help you by enriching your appreciation of the text. However, if you find connections between a text that no one else has ever noticed, no critic, no scholar, that is also incredibly good, because then you can be the first person to write about this relationship. So I think that's all I want to say on this topic for now. I hope you've enjoyed this. Like I said, it's very much a departure from what I would usually focus on, but I do notice that people are interested in this kind of topic. How does someone read? How does someone learn from literature? As you can see, no professor was necessary. I did not really need a library, although a library can help. And you can just do this at home and transform what you get from your reading. And it stops each book being a singular experience. It's a way to combine the reading experiences so that as you go on further and further, your ability to dip into a piece of writing and begin getting something from it is greatly enhanced. I can't really say anymore that I ever pick up a book kind of fresh, even if I've never read a word before by that particular author. As soon as I open it up and begin reading, everything else I've already read is kind of around me. It's kind of aura or penumbra. And that means that nothing is ever truly fresh, but it also doesn't mean anything bad that it's not fresh. It also means that you're finding things in there that allow you to orient yourself and understand what that artist is trying to do very quickly. You don't need to know their biography. You can find it from the text itself. So again, it's a very effective way to increase your knowledge and generate more richness when you're reading, rather than just saying, I've read that one, as if there's no possible way to connect the two. Okay, I really am done now. All I should do is say I welcome any comments or criticism. Just leave them in the comments box below, and I will return in due course. But for now, I must leave you with my customary farewell. Be safe, be strong, nanu nanu.